Some distances aren't measured in miles. They're measured in the exact number of inches a person keeps between themselves and the thing they want most, and the unbearable moment they stop counting. This story begins now. The bench was cold in the way that only stone could be cold. Not the sharp bite of outdoor frost, but something slower, more patient, the kind of chill that climbed through wool and settled into bone without announcing itself. King's Cross at 2:30 in the morning was a different creature entirely from its daytime self. The great arched ceiling, which swallowed thousands of voices each rush hour, now held only echoes. The distant clatter of a maintenance trolley, the occasional announcement from a speaker that no one was awake to hear, the soft percussion of rain against glass somewhere high above. Draco Malfoy sat on the bench nearest platform 9, his spine ruler straight, a book open across his knee. He had not turned a page in 40 minutes. His trunk, the old one, dragonhide trimmed, with the Malfoy crest worn almost to nothing at the corner, sat beside him with the particular solidity of something that contained everything he currently owned. His travelling cloak was pressed. His shoes were polished. His expression was the careful, arranged neutrality of a man who had spent 26 years perfecting the art of appearing unbothered. He turned a page. The words meant nothing. They were just shapes his eyes moved across while his mind did the thing it had been doing for 11 days, circling the same territory, the same charred walls, the same memory of green-white potion light blooming outward from the laboratory floor with a sound like the world cracking its knuckles. He'd been lucky to get the wards up in time. He'd been unlucky in every other sense. The eastern wing was structurally compromised. The rebuilding contractor, a discreet wizard from Edinburgh who owed Draco nothing but had accepted his galleons all the same, had quoted 6 weeks minimum, possibly 8. 8 weeks. Draco had nodded, signed the papers, and left Malfoy Manor through the front gate with his trunk floating behind him, and a plan that extended precisely as far as King's Cross Station, where he'd sat down 11 days ago, and, through some alchemy of pride and stubbornness and sheer unwillingness to explain himself to anyone, had simply not left. He had a considerable vault at Gringotts. That was not the issue. The issue was that checking into a hotel required speaking to someone, and speaking to someone meant answering questions. And answering questions meant admitting that the failed experiment had not been minor, not been manageable, not been the kind of setback a Malfoy handled with quiet competence. The issue was that he would rather sleep upright on a stone bench in a train station than watch a single person, anyone at all, try to suppress their satisfaction at his circumstances. He turned another page. He did not hear her approach, which should have been impossible, because Draco had trained himself since childhood to track movement in his peripheral vision the way some people tracked weather. But the station was doing something to acoustics tonight. The rain had thickened overhead, drumming now against the glass panels in the roof, and he was, if he was honest with himself, more tired than he'd been in years. The kind of tired that lived behind the eyes and pressed outward. She sat down on the other end of the bench, not close, 4 feet of cold stone between them. She set a canvas bag down at her feet, pulled out a thermos, and unscrewed the lid with the focused movements of someone who had a destination and was simply resting between points. She did not look at him. Draco did not look at her. He knew who she was. He had known the moment she sat, recognized the particular quality of stillness she carried, the way she occupied space with a kind of determined precision, as though she had calculated exactly how much of the world she was entitled to and taken only that. Hermione Granger. Her hair was darker in the rainlight, pulled back in a way that hadn't quite survived the day, curls escaping at the temples. She was wearing muggle clothes, dark coat, scarf the colour of autumn leaves, and she was reading something on her phone with the screen turned low. She hadn't looked at him yet. He turned a page. 3 minutes passed. The maintenance trolley rattled somewhere behind the barriers. Steam drifted from the thermos she'd set beside her on the bench, carrying the scent of something dark and strong. Coffee, real coffee, not the conjured variety that always tasted faintly of the spell used to make it. His stomach registered this information with an interest he refused to acknowledge. She looked up. Their eyes met for exactly the duration of a single breath, and then they both looked away. He back to the book, she back to her phone, with the synchronized precision of two people who had silently agreed on a protocol. Then, because she was Hermione Granger, and protocols she hadn't authored herself had always had a limited lifespan. The last train to Edinburgh left at midnight. Her voice was quiet, calibrated to the acoustic of the empty station rather than to any particular warmth. She wasn't looking at him when she said it. Draco did not respond for long enough that it might have seemed he hadn't heard. Then, I'm aware. The first one tomorrow isn't until 5:30. Also aware. Silence. The rain intensified briefly, a rushing sound high above, then steadied. She took a sip from her thermos. He watched, in his peripheral vision, the particular stillness of someone thinking, the slight pause, the infinitesimal tension in the shoulders. I'm waiting for someone on the overnight from Glasgow, she said. They've been delayed. Mechanical issue. She was giving him a reason to be here, handing it to him, unprompted, without conditions, as though she'd understood, had understood already before she sat down, possibly, that he would need a door left open that he could choose to walk through or not. Something moved in his chest. He pressed it flat. Granger. He said it the way he might have said enough, a single, quiet word with weight behind it. She turned and looked at him properly for the first time. Her eyes were very steady, brown, warm dark in the low light, with that quality he'd noticed years ago and never found a satisfying way to categorize. The look of someone who understood more than she was currently saying and was deciding moment by moment what to do with that understanding. You look terrible, she said. It was not unkind. It was the tone of a medical report delivered by someone who respected you enough not to soften it. His jaw tightened. Thank you. When did you last sleep somewhere horizontal? The question landed with the precision of a well-aimed hex. He felt his composure make a small sound. Not crack, not break, just a hairline shift, a pressure change he was reasonably certain didn't reach his face. His fingers adjusted their position on the book's spine. That's not your concern. No, she agreed easily. It isn't. She looked back at her phone. He waited for the follow-up, the press, the particular brand of Granger persistence that he'd watched drive lesser people to distraction over the years. It didn't come. She simply sat there, steam curling from her thermos, reading something with the focused calm of a woman who had made her point and was content to let it breathe. This was, somehow, worse. He looked at the book in his hands. Advanced Magical Theory, Volatile Compounds and Containment, 3rd edition. He'd been reading it, or pretending to read it, because it was the book he'd had open when the Eastern Wing went. A kind of penance, he supposed, or a habit. He wasn't sure anymore which of his behaviors had originated in choice. The manner, he said. He didn't know why he said it. The word appeared in the air between them, and he watched it with something close to alarm, the way one watches a dropped glass before it reaches the floor. She didn't move, just waited, the way very still water waits. There was an incident. Each word cost something, but the price was almost bearable with the station empty and her not looking at him. Potions laboratory, an experimental compound. The containment failed. The Eastern Wing is... He stopped, restarted. Structurally compromised. The repairs will take several weeks. The silence afterward was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of someone processing information carefully, giving it the respect of actual thought rather than the performance of reaction. And you've been here since. Not a question. He appreciated that. Questions would have required him to confirm it aloud, to watch the word yes take up space in the world. I have other options, he said instead. Her eyebrows moved, a fraction, barely, and he understood that she was choosing not to point out the obvious implication of a man sitting on a train station bench at 2:30 in the morning with a full trunk and a creased copy of a potions reference text. Of course, she said. Another silence. The rain softened overhead. Somewhere in the depths of the station, a door banged, carried a brief scrap of cold air across the concourse, and settled back into quiet. Draco realized he was no longer pretending to look at the book. He was looking at the middle distance, the green signs, the dark mouths of the platforms, the way the light pooled on the wet stone near the entrance. I have a spare room, Hermione said. The words were delivered without ceremony, without the slight upward lilt that would have made them a question. They simply arrived, factual and self-contained as everything she said. He felt his spine stiffen, not a choice, a reflex, something his body did before his mind had finished processing the offer. No, it has a proper bed. Granger. And a door with a lock, if that's what you're worried about. She finally looked at him. There was no pity in her face. And this was the thing that undid the word no before he could reinforce it, because he could have withstood pity, had years of practice deflecting it. What he saw instead was something practical and direct and utterly clear. The expression of a woman who had done a calculation, arrived at an answer, and was prepared to stand behind it regardless of whether the answer was welcome. I'm not offering because I feel sorry for you. I'm offering because you've been sitting on a stone bench in a train station for what appears to be some considerable time. And that's a waste of perfectly good sleep that neither of us is getting. His knuckles had gone pale where they gripped the book's spine. Why? He said carefully. Would you? Because it's the reasonable thing to do. Simple, unapologetic. She screwed the lid back onto her thermos with a crisp, decisive motion. and because I have a meeting at 8 in the morning, and I would prefer to negotiate the logistics of a temporary arrangement now, rather than discover you've developed pneumonia and made yourself someone else's problem. The ghost of something moved through him. Not quite amusement, not quite relief, before he could identify it and deal with it appropriately. "You're insufferable," he said. "Yes." She stood, collected her canvas bag and slung it over one shoulder. Then she looked at him with an expression that was not quite a challenge and not quite an invitation, but occupied some precise point between the two. "Are you coming?" Draco looked at the book in his hands. He looked at the trunk beside him. He looked at the platform signs and the rain-blurred glass overhead, and the bench that had learned the particular geography of his spine over 11 nights and given nothing back for the education. He closed the book. He stood. He said nothing. Not yes, not thank you, not anything that could be extracted later and used as evidence of a moment where Draco Malfoy had needed something and admitted it. He simply rose, took the handle of his trunk, and fell into step beside her, half a pace back, as she moved toward the station's main entrance. She did not smile. He was grateful for that beyond all reasonable measure. They walked out of King's Cross together into the London rain, and the station behind them resumed its emptiness as though they had never been there at all. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Islington that had been a textile warehouse in a previous life and still carried the memory of it. High ceilings with exposed iron beams, windows that ran nearly floor to ceiling along the eastern wall, the faint ghost of linseed oil in the brick that no amount of paint had fully persuaded to leave. It was not what he had expected. He wasn't certain what he had expected. Something more aggressively practical, perhaps. Walls lined exclusively with bookshelves and a single functional chair positioned under adequate lighting. And the bookshelves were there, certainly, covering the entire northern wall in a dense, colour-coded architecture that would have taken years to build. But there were also other things. A deep windowsill with 3 terracotta pots growing herbs that had no business thriving in London in October. A rug in the centre of the sitting room, woven in deep reds and golds, slightly uneven at one corner where it had been turned back and never quite straightened. 2 mismatched armchairs facing each other across a low table, scattered with papers and open journals. One chair clearly used more than the other, its cushion compressed into the particular shape of someone who read with their legs tucked beneath them. It was a room that had been lived in. That was the precise quality he couldn't immediately name. Not chaos, not disorder, but the accumulated texture of an actual life being conducted in a specific space over time. Draco stood just inside the doorway and said nothing while she moved through the room with the automatic efficiency of someone in their own territory, hanging her coat, dropping her bag onto the chair that wasn't hers, clicking on a lamp that threw warm amber light across the rug and the papers and the uneven corner. "Spare room is through there." She gestured toward a short hallway. "The handle sticks. You have to lift it slightly before you turn. Bathroom is opposite. There's a towel on the rail, the blue one, not the grey. The grey one is mine." "I understand the concept of towel ownership, Granger." She looked at him. "I know you do. I'm telling you anyway." She went to the kitchen, which was separated from the sitting room by a low counter rather than a wall. He heard the kettle find water. He stood where he was, trunk handle still in his grip, and looked at the bookshelves with the focused neutrality of a man conducting a surveillance operation on his own composure. The books were extraordinary, not in their number. He'd grown up in a house where books were furniture, but in their range. Magical theory pressed against Muggle philosophy. Charms reference texts leaned against what appeared to be a novel with a broken spine. Read so many times, its cover had softened to paper thinness. There was a section near the window where the books had clearly been shelved in a hurry, angled rather than upright, as though she'd been in the middle of something and had simply put them down temporarily, and the temporary had extended indefinitely. He recognized, with a precision that surprised him, that this was a home. He could not remember the last time he had been inside one. "Tea?" she called from the kitchen. "Yes." A pause. "Please." The word cost him nothing. That was what he told himself. He brought his trunk to the spare room, which was small and clean with a narrow bed against the wall, a single window overlooking the street below, and a side table with a lamp and nothing else on it. The mattress, when he pressed his hand to it, was firm. The pillow was cold. There was a quilt folded at the foot of the bed in the particular way of something that had been washed recently and folded with care. He stood in the center of the small room and let himself, for exactly 3 seconds, feel the full weight of the relief he was not going to acknowledge to anyone. And then he folded it away and went back to the kitchen. She handed him a mug without looking up from where she was leaning over the counter, uncapping a pen to make a note in one of the journals she'd brought from the sitting room. The tea was strong, made properly, no bag left in, no powdered milk, and he drank the first mouthful standing at the counter while she wrote something in a rapid, cramped hand, the pen moving with the particular urgency of someone transcribing a thought before it could escape. He watched her without meaning to. She'd taken the scarf off. Her hair was entirely free of its fastenings now. The day's efforts finally surrendered, and it fell around her face in the way that curly hair falls when it has been pressed into shape for hours and is finally, comprehensively done. She had ink on the side of her left hand from writing. She was frowning at the journal with the focused intensity of someone solving a problem, and she tucked her lower lip between her teeth in concentration, and she was. He looked back at his tea, entirely unconcerned with being observed. "I have a few ground rules," she said, not looking up. "Naturally. The kitchen is shared. If you use the last of something, make a note on the list on the refrigerator. If you can't cook, I can cook." She looked up at that, just for a moment. A quick, recalibrating glance, as though she'd been expecting a different answer, and was quietly updating her model of him to accommodate the actual one. "Good. Then we alternate, or we manage ourselves, whichever suits the day." She looked back at the journal. "I work from home several days a week, so there will be times I need quiet in the sitting room. The room is yours the rest of the time. I don't care what you do in your room." Generous. She ignored the edge on it with practiced ease. "I have friends who visit occasionally. I won't stop having them over, but I'll give you notice." "Fine. And I—" She stopped, set the pen down, turned to face him fully for the first time since they'd come in, leaning back against the counter with her arms loosely crossed, not in the braced way of someone anticipating argument, but in the resting way of someone thinking out loud. I won't ask you questions about the manner, about the circumstances. Whatever arrangement you've made with the contractors, that's yours. I don't need the details. Something in the air between them shifted, a change in atmospheric pressure, subtle as the moment before a weather change. He looked at her over the rim of his mug. She was watching him steadily, with that clear-eyed directness that he had spent years interpreting as aggression, and was only now, at 26, in her kitchen at 3 in the morning, beginning to understand was actually just honesty. She simply looked at things as they were. No performance of looking, no strategic glance, just the direct, unmediated attention of someone who considered reality worth engaging with. "Why not?" he said. "Because you didn't ask me for a negotiation. You accepted an offer." She picked up her pen again. Those are different things. He drank his tea. She made a note in the journal. The kettle, cooling now on its base, made a soft ticking sound as the metal contracted. Outside the long windows, London moved through its 3 in the morning rhythms. A taxi below, the distant particular wail of a siren that passed and faded, rain still touching the glass in the irregular percussion of a storm losing interest. "I'll pay," he said. "Whatever the going rate is for a room like this, I'll pay monthly in advance." She looked up. "You don't have to." "I'm aware I don't have to." His voice was even, controlled, but there was something underneath it that was not quite coldness, more like the crust that forms over something that's been very hot and is trying to hold its shape. "I'm telling you, I will. I don't accept charity, Granger. I accept arrangements." A beat of silence. Then, "All right." No argument. No pointed commentary about pride or practicality. Just acceptance, clean and without conditions. He didn't know what to do with her when she was like this, with the version of her that didn't fight back, not because she was conceding, but because she'd assessed the field and decided this particular ground wasn't worth the campaign. It was more disorienting than her arguments had ever been. He rinsed his mug at the sink. She closed her journal. "There's food in the refrigerator," she said, with her back to him now, moving toward the hallway. "Help yourself to whatever. I'll be up early. I won't disturb you." She paused at the hallway entrance. He could see her profile, the line of her nose, the slight furrow between her brows that hadn't quite smoothed out even now, the ink-stained left hand resting against the doorframe. "The handle on your room. Lift it first, then turn. Otherwise, it fights you." "You mentioned." "I know. She stopped. For the first time since the station, something surfaced briefly in her expression that wasn't quite composure. Something that was possibly exhaustion, or possibly something older and less nameable that lived in the same neighborhood. "Good night, Malfoy." He considered her standing there in the hallway light, and what he felt was not gratitude. He refused to call it that, at least not yet, but something quieter and more unmanageable. A kind of recognition, as though some part of him that had been holding its breath for 11 nights had, without his permission, begun to exhale. "Granger." She looked back. "The person you were waiting for," he said. "From Glasgow. Were they actually delayed?" The question sat between them like a stone dropped in water, and he watched the ripples of it move across her face. A fractional widening of the eyes, a slight compression of the lips, the look of someone deciding in real time how honest to be. She looked at him for a long moment. "Good night, Malfoy," she said again, and disappeared down the hall. He stood in her kitchen with an empty mug and the particular unsettling feeling of having been understood by someone he had not given permission to understand him. The lamp in the sitting room cast its amber light across the rug with its uneven corner. The herbs on the windowsill stood in their terracotta pots, thriving against all meteorological reason. The bookshelves held their dense, accumulated weight of years against the wall. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to the spare room, lifted the handle before he turned it, and felt the latch give cleanly. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark for a moment, coat still on, listening to the rain against the window and the faint, settling sounds of the building around him. Then he took his coat off, lay down on the cool quilt, and was asleep within minutes, deeply, immediately, heavily asleep, in the way of someone who has not been horizontal in 11 nights, and whose body has simply, wordlessly, decided that it is finished waiting for permission. The first morning announced itself through the eastern windows with the particular indifference of an October dawn. Grey light arriving in slow increments, not illuminating so much as simply making darkness less absolute. Draco woke before 6, which was habitual, a childhood inheritance from a household where sleeping past dawn had been considered a character flaw. He lay on the narrow bed for a moment, oriented himself by the unfamiliar texture of the ceiling above him, and then rose and dressed with the quiet precision of someone who had spent years inhabiting spaces where noise was a liability. The apartment was still. He stood in the doorway of his room and listened. Nothing from behind her closed door at the end of the hall, just the low breath of the building and the muted suggestion of the street below, buses beginning their early routes. He went to the kitchen. It was, in daylight, a more revealing space than it had been at 3 in the morning. The counter held a wooden block of knives, worn at the handle slots from years of use. The refrigerator was covered on one side with a magnetic notepad, the list she'd mentioned, and a scatter of other things. A receipt, a small photograph he didn't examine, a torn piece of paper with 3 words written on it in her rapid hand that he couldn't read from where he stood. The windowsill above the sink held a 4th terracotta pot he hadn't noticed the night before, this one with something that had gone leggy and pale from insufficient light, leaning toward the glass with a kind of exhausted optimism. He found the coffee in the second cabinet he tried. The grinder was on the counter. He stood for a moment, considering the noise it would make, then looked at the time, 6:10, and made the executive decision that anyone who woke this early on a weekday had already accepted a certain level of ambient sound as part of the contract. He ground the coffee quickly, made a full pot rather than a single cup, and while it brewed, he stood at the long eastern windows and looked at Islington acquiring its morning. The street below was wet from last night's rain, but the sky had cleared, pale and thin as paper, with the particular quality of autumn light that made everything look slightly more defined than usual, edges sharper, colours more committed. A fox crossed the road below with the unhurried confidence of a creature that understood the city belonged to something other than its human inhabitants at this hour. "You made coffee." He turned. She was standing at the kitchen entrance in a dressing gown the colour of old claret, her hair entirely untamed, both hands wrapped around nothing, reaching for something that wasn't there yet. The automatic gesture of someone who moves toward coffee before they are fully assembled as a person. She was not wearing her composure yet. It was the only way he could think to describe it. The version of her that stood in the kitchen doorway at 6 in the morning was not the version that sat at train stations and made measured, practical offers. This version had a crease from her pillow along her left cheek and was blinking at the coffee pot with an expression of uncomplicated need. He took a mug from the cabinet. The right cabinet, he noted. He'd found them on the first try, and poured without asking. She crossed to the counter and picked it up, and for a moment they simply stood there in the grey-gold morning light, both holding their coffee, not speaking, while the city below continued its gradual return to itself. "You slept," she said eventually, an observation, not a question. "Apparently." She looked at him over her mug, a quick, assessing glance, the kind that took inventory without making a production of it. Something in her expression settled fractionally. "Good," she said, as though this information completed a small private calculation she'd been running since the station. They did not speak again for several minutes. This was the thing he hadn't anticipated, the quality of her silences. He had expected her silences to feel like pauses between arguments, like held breath before the next point. Instead, she moved around the kitchen with the unhurried ease of someone entirely comfortable with quiet, pulling bread from a bin, putting 2 slices in the toaster with the automatic grace of 10,000 repetitions, pushing the journal from last night to the far edge of the counter to make space without looking at where it landed, because she already knew. She knew this kitchen the way he knew the layout of the manor's east wing, by instinct, by the accumulated cartography of years. He thought of the east wing and looked back out the window. "Do you always wake this early?" she asked. "Yes." "Me too." She retrieved her toast when it surfaced, applied butter with quick, economic strokes. "I used to fight it. In university, I was convinced I was supposed to be a different kind of person, the kind who stays up until 2 working and sleeps until 9. The corner of her mouth moved. "Turns out I'm the kind who's up at 6 regardless, and simply miserable if I've also been up until 2. "Last night, you were up until 3. "Yes." She bit into her toast. "I'm aware." He refilled his coffee. She took her toast to the small table near the window. Not the sitting room, but a separate table in the kitchen alcove, just large enough for 2 chairs, set against the wall with the leaning herb pot. She opened the journal, uncapped her pen, and began reading what she'd written the night before with the focused attention of someone picking up a thread. He stood at the counter. She did not tell him to sit. She did not perform unawareness of his standing there either. She simply read and occasionally wrote, and left the space for whatever he was going to do with it. He sat down across from her. The chair was wooden, solid, slightly too upright for comfort. He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the leaning herb pot on the windowsill beside them, which on closer inspection was a basil plant in the advanced stages of a slow decline. leaves yellowing at the edges, stems elongated toward the light in the particular way of something rationing its remaining energy. "Your basil is dying," he said. She looked up, looked at the plant, looked back at her journal with the expression of someone receiving information they have been aware of and have not yet dealt with. "I know. It needs more light or less water, both possibly. I keep forgetting to move it." He looked at the plant. He looked at the window. He stood up, moved the pot from the interior sill to the outer ledge of the window, where the morning light fell more directly. The plant listed slightly in the movement, then settled. He sat back down. Hermione was watching him. She looked down at her journal immediately when he met her eyes, and he watched the slight, swift motion of her pen resuming, a fraction too quickly, the mark of someone redirecting attention rather than returning it. The tip of her pen moved across the page. He drank his coffee. This was how the first morning passed. The routine that established itself over the following days had the quality of something neither of them had designed. It simply emerged, the way water finds a path through new terrain, following the contours of what was already there. He woke first, made coffee, stood at the windows. She appeared 20 minutes later, collected her mug without ceremony, read at the kitchen table. They ate breakfast in the particular companionable quiet of two people who had individually concluded that mornings were not for performance. He cooked on the third evening. This had not been discussed. She'd come home from the ministry with ink on both hands and a tension across her shoulders that was visible from across the room. And he had been in the kitchen already, because the kitchen was the room in the apartment where things had a purpose, and everything was where it was for a reason. And he found this clarifying in a way he didn't examine too closely. He'd found chicken in the refrigerator and something in the cabinet that was very close to what he needed, and by the time she'd changed and come back through the hall, it was on the table. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. He was at the counter, not looking at her, washing the pan he'd used for the sauce. "You didn't have to," she started. "The chicken needed using. Another day and it would have been a problem." A pause. He heard her pull out a chair. "Thank you," she said quietly. He turned off the tap. "The pepper's too much, probably. I didn't know how you take it." "I like pepper." He turned around. She was already seated, already pulling the dish toward her with both hands around the plate in that instinctive way of someone genuinely hungry. And when she took the first bite, something in her face did what faces do when they've been braced for disappointment and found the opposite. A small, involuntary softening, gone almost before it arrived. "It's good," she said. "I know." She looked up at him sharply, and he sat down across from her with his own plate and held her gaze with the particular neutral expression that she was, he could see, already learning to read. That the flatness of it was not arrogance, but the closest he knew how to come, in those early days, to admitting something without the machinery of admission. She looked back at her plate. "The basil," she said. "It's looking better." It was. 3 days of proper light had done visible work. The yellowing had arrested, and there was the suggestion of new growth at the crown, tight furled leaves the colour of new grass. He'd also, on the second morning, quietly adjusted its watering without mentioning it, tipping the saucer of stagnant water it had been sitting in and replacing it with nothing. Because the roots had been drowning in small increments, and drowning things don't need more of what's killing them. They need to be lifted clear. It just needed moving, he said. After dinner, she washed up. He dried, because the alternative was standing in the sitting room doing nothing, while she stood in the kitchen doing something, and there was a particular texture to unnecessary idleness that he found intolerable. They worked beside each other at the sink with the careful, half-conscious negotiation of two people learning the physical grammar of a shared space. Who steps left? Who reaches past whom? Which moment requires the pause of "excuse me," and which can be resolved by a simple spatial adjustment without words. Once, reaching for a plate she was handing him, his fingers covered hers for a second against the ceramic before she released it. Neither of them spoke. He dried the plate. She handed him the next one. The kitchen window held the dark reflection of the room, both of them standing at the sink, distorted and wavering in the old glass. And he looked at this reflection for a moment, with a feeling he could not have named precisely. Something with a texture of strangeness, but not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that comes from finding yourself somewhere you didn't plan to be, and discovering the coordinates are not, after all, hostile. Later, she was reading in the armchair that was hers, tucked into its particular compression, legs beneath her, a book held in both hands. And he was at the other end of the sitting room with his potions text, and the lamp between them cast its amber radius across both of them and left the rest of the room in soft shadow. And there was no sound except the occasional turn of a page and the reliable low voice of the building around them. She fell asleep in the chair. He noticed when the sound of her pages stopped and looked up to find her head tilted against the chair's wing, book still held loosely in both hands, breathing slow and even. She would wake with her neck aching. He knew this without having to think about it. It was the posture of someone an hour into sleep they'd planned to avoid. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his book. Then he stood, crossed the room quietly, and lifted the book from her hands before it could fall. He set it on the side table, marking her page first with a receipt he found in his pocket. He turned the lamp down to its lowest setting. He went back to his chair, collected his own book, and paused. She had a small crease reforming on her left cheek where it rested against the chair's wing. Her hands were open in her lap now, empty, ink-stained, relaxed in sleep into something that was somehow both more and less than her waking self. He went to his room. He did not ask himself why he'd marked her page. The argument began, as the most consequential arguments do, over something entirely beside the point. It was a Thursday evening, the third week of October, and the apartment had settled into the rhythms of two people who had learned each other's patterns without discussing them, who had arrived, through the daily accumulation of small adjustments, at something that functioned with a quiet efficiency that neither of them named aloud, because naming it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have required deciding what it was. Hermione came home late. Later than usual, later than she'd said. She'd mentioned 7, and the clock on the kitchen wall read 9:30 when the door opened. Draco was at the kitchen table with the potions text and a yellow notepad covered in calculations. and he heard the door and did not look up, because not looking up had become one of the vocabulary of their cohabitation, a way of communicating that her arrivals and departures were noted but not monitored, that she was free in her own space in the way she'd been free before he arrived in it. She came through the sitting room and into the kitchen and dropped her bag on the counter with more force than necessary. This he noticed, not the sound so much as the quality of it. Controlled force rather than carelessness, which meant she was holding something in check. He looked up. She was still in her work robes, which she usually changed within 10 minutes of getting home. Her hair had been up at some point and was now coming down in a way that suggested she'd pulled at it repeatedly throughout the day. There was a tension in the set of her jaw that he had learned, over 3 weeks, to read the way one reads weather. A particular compressed quality around her mouth that meant she was passing something with difficulty and had been for some time. She opened the refrigerator, closed it without taking anything, stood with her back to him and both hands on the counter edge. "Rough day," he said, not a question. "A colleague," she said, with a precision of vowels that meant she was being very careful with her words. "Submitted a report to the department head that incorporated 3 months of my research without any attribution. And when I raised it, I was told that perhaps I should be less precious about collaborative work environments." Draco set down his quill. She turned around. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, he understood immediately, but with the particular bright heat of someone who has been profoundly angry for several hours and has held it in a professional register all day and is now somewhere it doesn't need to be held anymore. "Collaborative," she said again, and the word had a compressed, lethal quality, as though collaborative means. She stopped, pressed her lips together, straightened the strap of her bag on the counter with a swift, unnecessary motion. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear this. You can say it. I know I can say it. I'm choosing whether to." He watched her. She moved to the far end of the counter, pulled a glass from the cabinet, filled it with water and drank half of it standing there, which was not how she usually drank. She usually sat. She was burning off something that needed motion, some charge that had been building all day in her chest and didn't know yet what shape to take. He knew that feeling with the intimacy of long personal acquaintance. "Who is he?" Draco said. She set the glass down. "That's not. I'm not going to do anything. I'm asking." "Cresswell. Adrian Cresswell. He's a senior researcher. He's been at the ministry 11 years, and the department head plays Quidditch with his older brother." She said it with a flatness that was worse than anger, the flatness of someone who has understood exactly how the mechanism works and has no illusion that understanding it constitutes leverage. "He'll receive a formal note. My research will be credited in the final published version. Everything will be handled correctly, and I will smile and accept the resolution, because that is how one maintains a functional working environment." She looked at the glass. "And the next time he needs something, he'll take it, because the note will have made it very clear that taking it costs him almost nothing." Silence settled between them, thick with the specific weight of an injustice accurately described. "You should report him properly," Draco said. "Not a formal note, a full complaint, documented, with the original timestamps on your research. I know. Then why? Because I've seen what happens to people who pursue it properly. Her voice was even now, controlled. But the control had a different quality to the composure she usually wore. Tighter, maintained by effort rather than temperament. 2 years ago, a colleague of mine filed a complete formal complaint against a senior undersecretary. She was right, entirely. Every piece of evidence was unambiguous. It took 14 months to resolve. In those 14 months, her assignments were reduced. She was excluded from 2 major projects. And when the resolution came, which vindicated her completely, she resigned 3 months later because the environment had become untenable. She picked up her bag and moved toward the hallway. "So, you do nothing," he said. She stopped. The air in the kitchen had a new quality. Something had shifted in it, some molecule rearranged, and he felt it along his forearms before he had a clear read on what had caused it. He watched her spine, the way it had straightened degree by degree in the 2 seconds between his words arriving and her processing them. "I do what's strategic," she said, without turning around, carefully. "That's the same thing." She turned around then. Her expression was not the bright anger of before. It had resolved into something colder and more focused, the expression of someone who has just received an incoming and is calculating trajectory. "Is it?" she said, not a question. "You described a system that punishes resistance. Your response is to not resist. That's compliance, Granger. You can give it a strategic framework if you like." "And what would you suggest?" Her voice was silk over iron. "What would Draco Malfoy do, with his name and his vault and his complete immunity to professional consequence? What would you suggest someone in an actually vulnerable position do?" The words landed with the precision of something aimed rather than thrown. He felt them arrive, a sharp atmospheric change, a pressure drop behind his sternum, the particular sensation of being accurately struck. His knuckles, resting on the table beside his notepad, lost some of their color. "That was..." He stopped. "True?" She was watching him steadily, and her expression had shifted again. The cold focus had fractured slightly at the edges, something less certain showing through, as though she'd watched the words hit and felt something about the impact that she hadn't entirely anticipated. "I'm sorry. That was accurate." It was still accurate, he said again. His voice had flattened into something that was not quite calm and not quite anger, but lived in the narrow corridor between them. "You're right that I've never navigated a system that didn't have some version of my name as a door. You're right that it's a different calculation for you. I wasn't accounting for that." The silence that followed had a different texture entirely from the silences they'd constructed over 3 weeks. Those had been comfortable, inhabited, worn smooth. This one had edges. She stood at the kitchen entrance, and he sat at the table, and the distance between them, which was perhaps 4 feet of ordinary space, felt like something that needed to be navigated carefully. "It wasn't fair," she said quietly. "What I said. It was honest. They're not always the same thing." He looked at her. She looked at him. And in that exchange, in the few seconds of unmediated attention before either of them decided what to do with it, something happened that had nothing to do with the argument and everything to do with what had been accumulating beneath it. in the 3 weeks of mornings and dinners and pages turned and hands briefly touching over a ceramic plate. She looked away first, pushed a hand through her hair, and several more pins surrendered their grip and fell silently to the floor. She watched them fall. Then she crouched down and picked them up, one by one, with the focused attention of someone who needs a task for their hands. "I do know what I should do," she said, from the floor, collecting the last pin. "About Cresswell. I know the right thing isn't always the strategic thing." "Then do the right thing. It costs something. Most right things do." She straightened up, pins in her closed fist. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not the analytical look, not the directness that met his eyes without blinking, but something less defended, something that had been worn down to a thinner layer by the long day, and the argument and whatever was moving underneath the surface of this conversation. "You're quite different," she said slowly, "from what I thought you'd be." He said nothing. His throat had done something complicated that he was resolving to ignore. "Is that—" She stopped, seemed to be choosing. "Is that something you had to work at? Being different? Or did it—" "Granger. Sorry." She uncurled her fist and looked at the pins in her palm. That was too much. It was. But his voice had lost its edge entirely, and they both knew it. It was also a reasonable question. She looked at him. He looked back. "Both," he said after a moment. "The answer is both." She was quiet for long enough that he wondered if she was going to leave it there, let the conversation fold back into whatever shape they usually kept it in. Then, "I'll file the complaint," she said. "The full one, with the timestamps." Something shifted in his chest, not dramatically, not the way things shifted in stories, but the way a stone settles in new ground, incrementally, irreversibly. "Good," he said. She moved toward the hallway again, and this time she went. He heard the door of her room close. Not hard, not soft, just closed. He sat at the table with his calculations and his potions text, and the specific residue of an argument that had gone somewhere neither of them had planned, that had opened a door, not resolved, not closed, but open, that could not now be easily shut. He picked up his quill. He looked at the notepad. The calculations there were precise, meticulous, the product of 3 hours of focused work, and they meant nothing to him right now. His mind was on a different equation, less tidy, no clean solution presenting itself, variables that kept rearranging when he thought he'd fixed them. "Quite different from what I thought you'd be." He put the quill down. From her room, he heard nothing, just the settling quiet of the apartment around her, the building making its low sounds. But after a while, perhaps 20 minutes, perhaps 30, he heard her door open and her footsteps in the hall, and the sound of the kitchen tap running briefly, and then the footsteps returning. She stopped outside his door. He did not move. A pause. 2 seconds. 3. Then her footsteps continued to her own room, and her door closed again with the same undemonstrative click as before. He sat in the silence she left behind. On his notepad, the calculations waited. The kitchen clock moved through its increments. The basil on the windowsill stood in its reclaimed light, putting out new leaves in the dark, with the quiet insistence of something that has been given what it needs and is simply, steadily responding. The rain came back on a Sunday. Not the thin, apologetic rain of early October, but something with more conviction, a steady, heavy curtain of it that arrived before dawn and showed no intention of leaving, turning the long eastern windows into a continuous grey wash and filling the apartment with a particular kind of interior light, the light of a day that has decided to remain inside with you, whether you planned for company or not. Draco woke to the sound of it and lay still for a moment, listening. There was something in sustained rainfall that had always worked on him like a sedative. Not the kind that dulled, but the kind that slowed everything to its actual speed, stripped the performance of urgency from the day before it began. He lay there in the narrow bed while the rain spoke against the glass and felt, for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, no particular impulse to be anywhere other than where he was. This was information he filed carefully and did not examine directly. When he came to the kitchen, she was already there, which was unusual for a Sunday. She typically slept an hour later on weekends, a small concession to herself that he'd noticed and quietly factored into his mornings. But she was at the kitchen table with both hands around her coffee and her hair loose and the journal open, and she was not writing in it. She was looking out the rain-blurred window at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone who has woken up inside a thought and hasn't found the edge of it yet. He made his coffee without speaking. She didn't look up. He sat down across from her. Outside, the rain. "I filed it," she said, without preamble, still looking at the window. He didn't need to ask what. "When?" "Friday afternoon. Full complaint, original timestamps, every piece of documentation I had." She turned her mug slowly between her palms. "My hands were shaking when I submitted it." He looked at the table. "But you submitted it." "I submitted it." A pause. "My department head wants to meet Monday morning. His assistant sent the request Friday evening, which means he saw it before he left for the weekend, and it was the first thing he dealt with." She glanced at him then, a quick sideways look. "That's either very good or very bad." "It's not bad," he said. "If it were bad, he'd have left it until Tuesday. Made you wait. The speed is leverage acknowledgement. He knows what the timestamps show." She considered this. He watched her process it the way she processed everything. Not quickly, but thoroughly, turning it over, checking it from multiple angles, arriving at a conclusion she could stand behind. Yes, that's probably right. It's definitely right. I grew up watching men like your department head decide what to address urgently and what to let rot. Speed means he understands the exposure. She looked at him again, longer this time. "You're unexpectedly useful, Malfoy." "Don't sound so surprised." "I'm not surprised. She seemed to search for the word, noting it, for accuracy. The rain intensified briefly, a gust of wind driving it harder against the glass, and then steadied. She opened her journal, looked at what was written there, closed it again. He recognized this gesture, the touch and retreat of someone who has more to say than they've decided to say. "The shaking hands," he said, carefully. "That wasn't fear." She looked at him. It was the right thing. Those are different physical experiences, even when they feel the same. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something landing. Not dramatically, not with force, but with the quiet weight of something true finding level ground. She looked at him across the table in the grey rainlight, and her expression was open in a way he'd seen only in unguarded moments. The sleeping face in the armchair, the kitchen doorway at 6 a.m. before she'd assembled herself for the day. "How do you know the difference?" she asked. He looked at his coffee. "Fear keeps you still. The other kind moves through you and comes out the other side. A beat, too." "Yes," she said quietly. "That's yes." They stayed at the table through the morning, which was unusual. Sundays had their own domestic pattern. She read in her armchair. He worked at the kitchen table. They moved around each other with the practiced courtesy of the established arrangement. But the rain had dissolved the usual structure of the day, replaced it with something more fluid, and neither of them seemed inclined to reinstate it artificially. She made more coffee at some point. He moved his notepad aside, and she put a plate of toast between them without comment, and they ate from it intermittently the way people eat when food is beside the point. And she read, and he calculated, and occasionally one of them said something that had been sitting quietly in the back of their mind, the kind of thing that surfaces on rainy Sundays when the usual armature of a day isn't there to hold the usual distances in place. "Did you always want to do potions research?" she asked at some point around noon, looking at his notepad with its dense columns of notation. "I wanted to do something that required precision," he said. "Something where the result either worked or it didn't. No committee to interpret the outcome." She absorbed this. "That's not nothing. Wanting clear results." "What about you? The ministry, was that always the plan?" She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "The plan changed approximately 11 times between 17 and 22. The ministry was the version that survived contact with actual reality." She turned a page in her book. "I wanted to write for a while. Not fiction, theoretical work. Long-form arguments about magical law and its gaps." "Why didn't you?" "I did." A pause. 3 unpublished manuscripts on my hard drive. The ministry work pays and the research matters. The writing it's there. It just doesn't go anywhere yet." She said yet with a particular quality of conviction, the word carrying weight she'd clearly put there deliberately. "You should publish them. Eventually. That means never in your vocabulary." She looked up sharply. He met her eyes with his neutral expression, and he watched the sharp look resolve, watched her decide not to argue the point, because she knew he was right. Her mouth did something complicated. "Possibly," she admitted. After lunch, which he made, a simple thing with eggs and whatever was in the refrigerator, because it was Sunday and the day felt like his to occupy differently, she moved to the sitting room, and he followed without planning to, and they occupied their respective chairs with their respective materials, and the rain continued its patient work against the glass. At some point in the afternoon, the light changed. The heavy grey shifted towards something warmer and more amber as the cloud cover thinned in the west. And she set her book down and stretched, both arms overhead, with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who has forgotten or perhaps stopped caring that they're being observed. He looked back at his notepad. "Tell me about the manor," she said. His pen stopped. "Not the accident." She was looking at the window, not at him. "Before, what it was like." He considered refusing. He had the architecture of refusal well built, the deflection, The flat look, the conversational pivot that communicated this territory, is closed without requiring him to say it directly. He'd used it his entire life with varying degrees of success and no degree of satisfaction. "Cold," he said. Most of it was cold, most of the year. The main rooms were maintained, fires, warming charms, but the corridors between them were just stone and air. He looked at the window. "I used to run between rooms when I was small, not because I was in a hurry, because the cold in the corridors had a particular quality, and moving through it quickly felt better than standing in it." She said nothing, just listened, that quality of attention she had that made the space feel safe enough to continue. The library was warm, though, south-facing, thick rugs. My mother used to read there in the afternoons. He paused. "She read to me there when I was very young, before it became clear that being read to was not the kind of thing one mentioned." "What did she read?" He looked at his hands, at the pen resting between two fingers. "Everything. She had no particular genre loyalty. One week it would be advanced transfiguration theory, the next something entirely muggle that she'd acquired through channels she never explained." The ghost of something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but a warmth, the residual heat of a very old memory. She had a copy of Middlemarch with her maiden name written inside the cover. She never told my father she had it. Hermione's breath caught, barely audible, the smallest sound, but the apartment was quiet enough that it reached him. "She sounds..." She stopped, started differently. "You loved her very much." "I did," he said, simply without armor. "I do." The rain had softened to something barely there, a suggestion of itself, touching the glass with the lightness of an afterthought. The amber light from the west had deepened, filling the sitting room with a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the quality of late Sunday afternoon, which is its own particular kind of hour. She had turned to look at him at some point during his speaking and hadn't looked away, and he became aware of this gradually, the way one becomes aware of warmth, not as a single moment, but as an accumulation, a slow recognition that the air between them had changed its quality without announcing the change. He looked at her. She was sitting with her legs tucked beneath her in the compressed chair, book closed in her lap, and she was watching him with an expression he had no established category for. Not the analytical look, not the composed directness, not the unguarded morning face. Something else. Something that had elements of all of them, and had also moved beyond them into territory that neither of them, he thought, had fully charted. "Draco," she said. Not Malfoy. His given name, which she had not used before, not once in 3 weeks, and which arrived in the room now with the effect of a key finding a lock, some chamber in his chest opening that he hadn't known was closed. He said nothing. He was not certain he could just at that moment. "I'm glad," she said carefully, "that you were on that bench." The amber light held them both. The rain made its last quiet sound against the glass and stopped. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed, a brief intrusion of the ordinary world, and then the silence came back, deeper than before. He looked at her across the short, charged distance between their chairs. She had not looked away. Her hands were still in her lap, loosely around the closed book, and there was a stillness to her that was different from her usual stillness. Not the stillness of composure, of deliberate self-containment, but something that had arrived on the other side of all that effort, something that had simply stopped moving because it had found a place that felt, against all expectation, like rest. He became aware that he had leaned forward, not dramatically, perhaps only an inch, perhaps two, but the movement was not strategic and was not performed and had not been decided. It had simply happened, the way the basil had leaned toward light before anyone had thought to move it. "Hermione," he said. Her lips parted, the barest fraction. And then her phone, the muggle one she kept on the side table, silenced during the day, lit up with a brightness that cut across the amber like something deliberate, and she looked at it reflexively, the way the body responds to sudden light before the mind has weighed in, and the moment, that precise, suspended, irretrievable moment, stepped back from the edge it had been standing on. She looked at the screen. She looked at him. "I need to," she said. "Yes," he said. "Of course." She unfolded from the chair and took the phone to the hallway, and he heard her voice begin, low and professional, and he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and released a breath he had been holding for what felt like considerably longer than this afternoon. His heart was doing something ungoverned and unhelpful in his chest. He noted this with the detached interest of a man cataloguing unexpected experimental results, and looked at the window and watched the last of the rain dry slowly from the glass. He pulled back on a Tuesday. There was no announcement, no argument to justify it, no incident significant enough to serve as reasonable cause. It happened the way tides happen, not as a decision, but as a consequence of something gravitational, some deep-running force that had been building pressure beneath the surface of ordinary days, and had finally found its expression not in drama, but in the quiet, incremental withdrawal of a man who had spent his entire life understanding that proximity was a form of danger. She noticed on Wednesday. Not the withdrawal itself, not yet, but the quality of the Tuesday evening, which had been different in ways she couldn't initially name. He had been present in all the measurable ways. He'd made coffee, answered when she spoke, passed her the salt at dinner with the automatic grace of someone who had learned her habits. But there was a new distance in the way he occupied the apartment, a degree of separation, as though he'd recalibrated the radius of himself and stepped back inside it. She thought at first it was tiredness. His work had intensified in recent days. The contractors at the manor had encountered something unexpected in the East Wing's structural assessment, which had added 2 weeks to the timeline and required him to revise his rebuilding specifications from scratch. She'd heard him up past midnight on Monday, the low scratch of his quill against parchment carrying through the wall between their rooms, with a patience she recognized as the sound of someone working through frustration rather than with it. By Thursday, she knew it wasn't tiredness. It was in the angle of his chair at the kitchen table, turned 3 degrees more toward the window than his usual position. It was in the way he responded to her, not coldly, nothing she could point to and say this, but with a precision that had replaced the ease they'd been building, the ease of 2 people who had stopped calculating every word because the space between them had become, against all expectation, safe. The calculation was back. She could hear it in the slight pause before he answered, the fractional delay of someone choosing rather than simply speaking. She said nothing. She had a considerable instinct for when pressure would help and when it would calcify the thing it was meant to loosen, and she applied that instinct here, giving him the Tuesday and the Wednesday and the Thursday with their new distances intact, going about her own mornings and evenings with the outward composure of a woman who had not spent considerable portions of the last 72 hours being aware of every room he was in. On Friday, she came home to find the apartment empty. This was not unusual. He kept his own schedule, came and went without obligation to inform her, and she had always been careful to signal that this was how it should be. But there was a quality to the emptiness on Friday evening that was different from his ordinary absence, and she stood in the sitting room for a moment, registering it, before she identified what it was. His coat was not on the hook by the door. He always left his coat on the hook when he was in the building. She sat in her chair. She opened her book. She read the same page 3 times and retained nothing from it, and eventually closed the book and sat with it in her lap and looked at the window where the basil plant was putting out its 4th set of new leaves in the light he'd moved it into. And she allowed herself to feel, without the performance of not feeling it, the specific and inconvenient truth that had been accumulating in her chest since a Sunday afternoon when he had said her name as though it was something he'd been carrying for a long time and had finally, cautiously, set down. She had not misread that moment. She was not given to misreading, not in text, not in evidence, not in the emotional semiotics of a room. She had sat across from him in the amber light, and she had watched the inch of his leaning forward, and she had heard her own name in his voice, and she had felt, with a precision that frightened her slightly, the full weight of what had been building between them since a stone bench at 2:30 in the morning. And then her phone had lit up, and the moment had dissolved, and they had both, with the careful mutual courtesy of 2 people protecting the same fragile thing from different sides, pretended that it had not happened. And now he was not here. She heard the door at 8:30. She did not look up from her book. The same book, a different page now, though she could not have said what was on it. She heard him come in, heard the coat go on the hook, heard the particular sound of someone who has been outside in October, cold for some hours, coming into warmth. A breath, a slight shift in air pressure as the door closed. He came as far as the sitting room entrance. "You're home," he said, neutral, the new precision. "I live here," she said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. A pause. She turned a page she hadn't read. "I went to the site," he said. "The manor. The contractors found a secondary compromise in the East Foundation. It's affecting the timeline. I needed to see it." "How bad?" "Another 3 weeks, possibly 4. His voice was controlled in a way that told her it had cost something to make it so. She knew what the manor meant to him, not as a monument to the family name, but as the specific texture of his mother's library, of south-facing warmth and a hidden copy of Middlemarch. Every week of delayed return was another week of that being inaccessible, reduced to a structural problem rather than a place. "I'm sorry," she said. He said nothing. She set her book down. "Draco." The name stopped him. She felt it stop him, the almost imperceptible stillness of someone who has been struck somewhere specific. He stayed where he was, at the sitting room entrance, not coming in, not leaving. "Sit down," she said. A long pause. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to. Then he crossed the room and sat in his chair, not at the extreme distance from her, she noted, not the recalibrated radius, but his usual position, close enough that the lamp between them lit both their faces in its amber radius. He looked tired. Not the surface tiredness of a disrupted night, but something that lived deeper, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been managing something emotionally expensive for several days without acknowledgement. "What happened on Tuesday?" she said. "That made you step back." His jaw tightened. "Nothing happened on Tuesday. Something changed. People's moods change, Granger. It doesn't require forensic analysis." She looked at him steadily. He met her eyes with a flat expression, the one she'd learned, the one that wasn't arrogance, but was the architecture of self-protection wearing arrogance's shape. She held the look long enough that the flatness began to cost him something visible. "You're doing it now," she said quietly. "The thing where you make yourself very contained and very precise and very managed, so that I can't get close enough to see whatever is actually happening." A muscle moved in his jaw. "I've watched you do it with everyone," she continued, keeping her voice even, conversational, without the heat that would have given him something to deflect against. "At the ministry events we've both attended, in shops, with the contractors, probably. You do it so smoothly that most people don't even register it as something being withheld. They just think they've received a complete version of you and move on." "And you don't move on," he said, flat, careful. "I notice the difference." The lamp held them both in its radius. Outside the window, the October night had settled into itself. No rain tonight, just the dense quiet of a city that had turned its collar up. His hands were resting on the chair arms, not gripping, but with the slight tension of controlled stillness. "Sunday," he said, eventually. The word came out with the quality of something that had been held in a closed fist for 5 days and was only now being opened. "On Sunday, in this room, something—" He stopped. His gaze went to the window. "I don't do that well, whatever that was." "What do you think it was?" He looked at her with an expression that was not the flat protection and was not yet whatever lived behind it, but was something in transit between the two. A man standing in his own doorway, hand on the frame, deciding. "Something I don't have a reliable history of managing without damage," he said carefully. She held this, turned it over. "Damage to what?" A long silence. "To the other person," he said. The honesty of it arrived in the room like a change in temperature, sudden, unambiguous, arriving from an unexpected direction. She looked at him, this man in her armchair who had moved her basil plant and marked her page and cooked chicken on a Tuesday because the chicken needed using, who had said his mother's name in the warmth of a rainy afternoon with the undefended simplicity of real love, who had told her to file the complaint and been right about the department head's response, and said both when she'd asked how he'd become different. "You think proximity to you is damaging," she said. He said nothing, which was its own answer. "Draco." She leaned forward slightly in her chair. Not far, just enough to close 1 degree of the distance between them, 1 increment of the radius. "I'm not fragile." "I know you're not." "Then what you're protecting me from isn't about your fragility." His voice had dropped, and it carried in the quiet room without effort. "It's about mine." He held her gaze with something that was clearly costing him in real time. She could see it in the slight whitening at the corner of his jaw, the way his hands had gone still against the chair arms, with a stillness that was the opposite of relaxation. "I've spent a significant portion of my life being someone that people eventually needed to put distance between themselves and I am familiar with being the reason that a situation becomes untenable, and I would rather." He stopped. His eyes dropped briefly, returned. "I would rather put the distance there myself before it gets taken from the other direction." She looked at him for a long moment in the amber light. She thought about saying, "You're not that person anymore." But she understood, with the instinct that lived below argument, that this was not what was needed. Not a counterclaim, not a reassurance that asked him to simply believe a different version of himself. What he was describing was not a misapprehension that could be corrected. It was a fear that had been built from actual material, actual history, real consequences he had actually caused and actually carried, and to simply tell him he was wrong would be to make it smaller than it was. So instead, she said, "I know." He looked at her. "I know who you were." She said it simply, without weight, without the precision of a verdict. "I also know who's been in this apartment for the last 4 weeks. Those are both true at the same time. I'm not asking you to choose between them or to pretend either one doesn't exist." His expression did something she had never seen it do. Not in the 3 years of orbiting the same professional circles, not in 4 weeks of shared mornings and dinners and rainy Sundays. It opened. Fractionally, briefly, in the way of something that has been braced against pressure for a very long time and has discovered with surprise that the pressure has stopped. "What are you asking?" he said. She looked at him, at the lamp between them and his face in its light, and the chair that had learned the shape of him over 4 weeks as thoroughly as it had learned hers over years. She thought of Sunday, of the amber afternoon, and the inch of his leaning, and her name in his voice like something being set down with care. "I'm asking you," she said quietly, "to stop managing the distance." The room held perfectly still. His eyes were very steady on hers. The lamp threw its warm light. Outside the window, the city breathed its dark, ordinary breath, indifferent and ongoing. And inside the apartment, something was shifting with the slow, irrevocable movement of a weight that has been balanced for a long time, finally finding its true center of gravity. He uncurled his hands from the chair arms. He did not close the distance. Not yet. That was not what this moment was. But he uncurled his hands, and he looked at her without the architecture of protection arranged across his face. And what she saw there was something that required, she thought, considerably more courage than anything else she had watched him do. She reached across and turned the lamp down. Not off, just lower, the amber deepening to something closer to firelight, and in the new quality of the room's warmth, they sat in their chairs and did not speak, and the not speaking was entirely different from the careful silences of the first weeks. It was not managed, not constructed, not maintained by effort. It simply was. And that, for this evening, was sufficient. The Manor's contractors sent their revised timeline on a Saturday morning, 5 weeks remaining, weather permitting, with a note about the East Foundation work proceeding ahead of schedule. Draco read the letter at the kitchen table while Hermione made coffee, and he set it down on the surface between them with the particular careful flatness of someone placing something they haven't yet decided how to feel about. She glanced at it, read the heading, said nothing, and turned back to the coffee. This was what had changed since Friday. Not dramatically. There had been no grand renegotiation of terms, no conversation that formally acknowledged the conversation they'd had. But something had been set down between them that Friday evening, some weight they had each been carrying on their own side of the apartment, and the setting down of it had altered the atmosphere in a way that was not loud, but was comprehensive. The careful precision he'd been maintaining was gone, or rather, it had been replaced by something different, not its absence, but its evolution, the difference between a door that is locked and a door that is simply closed. He was present again, in the full sense, not just in the room, but in it, occupying it with the same density as the furniture, as real and as particular as the grain of the kitchen table. She brought his coffee without being asked and set it beside the letter. He picked it up. Their fingers did not touch this time, but the space between them had a quality, a kind of atmospheric pressure, a static awareness of proximity that had not been there in the first weeks and was now simply part of the texture of any room they occupied together. 5 weeks, he said. That's not long. She sat down across from him with her own mug and looked at the middle distance with the expression of someone doing arithmetic in a register that has nothing to do with numbers. No, she said, it isn't. He looked at the letter. She looked at her coffee. The morning went about its business around them. The city below gathering its Saturday energy, the basil plant on the windowsill in its reclaimed health, the refrigerator with its list and its photograph, and the 3 words in her handwriting that he had never been close enough to read. Hermione. She looked at him. I owe you. He stopped, began differently. I've been thinking about what you said. On Friday. He held his mug in both hands and looked at it with the focused attention of someone who is making themselves not look away from a thing by looking at something else instead. About knowing who I was and who I've been here, both at once. She waited. I've spent a great deal of time, he said carefully, in the belief that those 2 things are irreconcilable, that whatever I am now is contingent, provisional, subject to revision by anyone who decides the earlier version is the more accurate one. He looked up. I've arranged my life to require as few people as possible to make that judgment. I know, she said. You don't operate that way. He said it with the quality of someone describing something remarkable without quite being willing to call it remarkable yet. You hold contradictory information simultaneously without needing to resolve it into a single verdict. I've watched you do it with cases at the ministry, with your research. You can look at something that has genuine fault and genuine merit and not feel compelled to flatten it into one or the other. She tilted her head. Is that what you think you are? Something with genuine fault and genuine merit? Isn't it accurate? It's accurate for everyone, Draco. That's not a specific condition of yours. He looked at her with an expression that moved through several territories in quick succession. Resistance, consideration, and then something that was very close to the thing that had shown on his face on Friday when she'd asked him to stop managing the distance. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't simple," she said. "I'm saying it's not singular. You're not the only person in this room who has done things they carry with them." She looked at her coffee. "I spent 3 years making decisions in extraordinary circumstances that I wouldn't make the same way again. I've been unkind to people who deserved better. I've been wrong in ways that mattered." She paused. "I don't think that makes me permanently defined by those things. I extend myself the same reading I extend to evidence. Provisional, subject to new information, open to revision." He was quiet for a long moment. "You should publish the manuscripts," he said. She looked up, caught off guard by the pivot. The theoretical work, the long-form arguments about magical law. His voice had shifted into something that was not the managed neutrality and was not the vulnerable openness of Friday, but was something between them, direct, certain, carrying its own weight. The way you just described holding contradictory information without flattening it, that quality applied to legal theory would be extraordinary. It's already extraordinary. You should let other people have access to it. She looked at him for a long moment, and something happened in her expression that she appeared to have no immediate intention of managing, a warmth that moved across it like light moving across water, present and then deepening rather than retreating. "You're doing it again," she said. "What?" "Being unexpectedly useful." He held her gaze, and what passed between them in that moment had the quality of something that had been building for a very long time, arriving at a point of recognition. Not resolution, not yet, but the clear acknowledgement of what it was. The day unfolded at the unhurried pace of Saturdays that have decided to be themselves fully. She worked at the table for a portion of the morning while he read, and then they went out together. This was new, going out together. They had not done it before. It had happened without being planned when she mentioned needing something from the market 2 streets over, and he had simply stood up and put his coat on. They walked through Islington in the thin November light, their breath making brief clouds, not touching, but close enough that the occasional uneven paving stone brought their shoulders briefly into contact, and neither of them adjusted the resulting proximity. The market was small and earnest, selling the kind of produce that has been grown by someone rather than manufactured, and she moved through it with the decisive efficiency of a woman who knows exactly what she wants and where it is. He walked beside her and watched her examine a bundle of herbs with the focused concentration she applied to everything, turning it in her hands to check the stems. "Tarragon," she said. Not to him particularly, but not to him either. "I want to try something with chicken." "Use less cream than you think you need," he said, "and add it at the end, off the heat." She looked at him. "I know how to make a sauce, Malfoy." "You've never made that particular sauce." "How do you know what sauce I'm—" "Because you're holding tarragon and you said chicken, and there's only one logical destination." He looked at the herbs with a neutral expression. "Less cream. Off the heat." She looked at him with narrowed eyes and the compressed mouth that preceded either an argument or amusement. And today it preceded amusement. A reluctant, clearly involuntary twitch at the corner of her lips that she did not successfully suppress. "Fine," she said. "Less cream." He looked away before she could see the thing that happened to his face when she almost smiled. They had dinner at the kitchen table with the tarragon chicken and the sauce made correctly. She had followed his instruction with the particular expression of someone determined not to seem like they're following instruction. And they sat across from each other in the kitchen's warmth while the November dark pressed against the windows, and they talked. Not the careful exchanges of the first weeks, not the managed communication of people in diplomatic proximity, but genuinely the conversation of two people who have stopped calculating what the other person is going to do with what they say. He talked about the east foundation of the manor and what it was going to cost to restore it properly rather than adequately, and the distinction between those two things which his 20-year-old self would not have cared about, and his current self could not imagine not caring about. She talked about the meeting with her department head, which had gone as he'd predicted. Cresswell was being managed, her research would receive proper attribution, and the department head had used the word oversight 7 times in 40 minutes to avoid using the word theft. 7, Draco said. That's almost impressive. Men like that usually run out of synonyms by 4 or 5. He had a thesaurus energy about him, she agreed seriously. Very prepared. He laughed. It arrived without announcement. A real laugh, not the cold amusement she'd occasionally seen move across his face in place of it, but something actual that engaged the full musculature of his expression and reached his eyes and made him look, for a moment, entirely like someone she did not yet fully know and very much wanted to. She looked at her plate. The warmth in her face was not, she concluded, the candlelight. After dinner they washed up as they always did, shoulder to shoulder at the sink, and when she handed him a pan, their fingers crossed on the handle with the unhurried certainty of something that had stopped happening accidentally and had not yet been acknowledged as happening on purpose. He held it, the pan, her hand beneath his on the handle, for a moment longer than necessary. She did not move her hand. He dried the pan. She handed him the next thing. But the static of that moment remained in the kitchen air, a charge that the ordinary sounds of washing up moved through without dispersing. Later, in the sitting room, she pulled the 3rd manuscript from her hard drive and opened it for the first time in 8 months. She sat in her chair with her laptop and read the opening section with the expression of someone discovering whether a fear is justified or merely habitual. He was at the other end of the sitting room with his potions text, and he did not ask what she was doing, because he had learned the particular quality of her concentrated silences and understood that questions were not what they called for. An hour passed. She closed the laptop. "It's not as bad as I remembered," she said. "It's probably better than you've been telling yourself," he said, without looking up from his book. She looked at the closed laptop on her knees. Then she looked at him. The dark head bent over the text, the line of his jaw in the lamplight, the quality of stillness he had when he was genuinely absorbed in something, which was entirely different from the managed stillness of self-containment. She had learned the difference. She had been learning the differences between all his stillnesses, cataloguing them with the part of her that catalogued things without being asked to. "Draco," she said. He looked up. "When you go back," she said, "to the manor, when the work is done, and you go back. She held his gaze with the directness she usually applied to things she was certain about. At this moment, she was not certain. Or rather, she was certain of her own part of this, and not certain what he was going to do with it. I don't want things to go back to whatever we were before. The professional acquaintance version. The people who see each other at ministry events and exchange correct greetings. His book had lowered, almost imperceptibly in his hands. I'm not saying it has to be. She stopped, revised. I'm saying that what's here, in this apartment, whatever this is, I don't want to lose it to geography. She paused. Or to you deciding that leaving is the version of managing distance that you can live with. The lamp threw its faithful light between them. He looked at her with the open expression, the one he had let her see on Friday, the one without the architecture of protection. It was steadier tonight, less like something being risked, and more like something being chosen. I'm not going to do that, he said. You might, she said honestly. You might decide it's the safest thing. Hermione. Her name and his voice had the same quality it had had on that Sunday afternoon. Something being set down carefully, something that had been carried with deliberate attention and was now being placed into someone else's hands. I've been deciding what's safest for 30 years. I'm aware of what it produces. She looked at him. What it produces, he said, is a very well-managed life, with almost nothing in it that wasn't put there by calculation. He held her gaze steadily, as though he had made a decision sometime in the last several days, and was now simply standing inside it. I find I am no longer particularly interested in that as an outcome. The room was very still. She felt something loosen in her chest, not dramatically, not with the force of something breaking, but with the long, quiet relief of something that has been held under tension for weeks, finally being allowed to find its natural shape. Outside the window, London carried on its permanent, indifferent enterprise. Inside the apartment, the lamp burned its amber radius, and the basil plant stood in its health on the sill, and two people sat in their chairs looking at each other across a distance that was no longer being managed by either of them. She reached over and turned the lamp up just slightly. He noticed the faintest movement at the corner of his mouth. She looked at him and did not look away, and what lived in the space between them now had nothing managed or constructed about it. It was simply there, as present and specific as the grain of the table or the tooth of old parchment or the particular amber quality of lamplight on a November night, real in the way that only things that have been arrived at slowly and honestly are real. 5 weeks. She was already thinking about what happened after them. The last week arrived without ceremony. It was the kind of week that knows what it is, final in the way of things that have been counted toward, each morning carrying the particular weight of a diminishing number, neither of them mentioned aloud. The contractors had confirmed Thursday. The East Foundation work was complete, the structural assessment signed, the manor ready to receive its owner again after 8 weeks of absence. Draco had received the final letter on Monday and left it on the kitchen counter where they could both see it, and neither of them had moved it. And by Wednesday it had accumulated a coffee ring on one corner from his mug and a small ink smudge from her pen, which seemed, in the particular emotional mathematics of that week, appropriate. She woke on Tuesday to the sound of him in the kitchen earlier than usual. 5 o'clock, perhaps earlier, the darkness outside her window still absolute. She lay in the quiet and listened to the low, careful sounds of a man trying not to wake someone, and she pressed her face briefly into the pillow and allowed herself, in the privacy of her own room, to feel the full, unmanaged truth of what the week was. She had not slept particularly well since Saturday. Not from distress, or not only from distress, but from the particular alertness of someone who has become attuned to a presence and is already, involuntarily, beginning to register its prospective absence. She had found herself noticing things with a new acuity. The specific sound of his footsteps in the hall, which she could now distinguish from any other sound the building made. The way he left the kitchen in the mornings, coffee pot ready for her, the second mug already down from the cabinet, never commented upon, simply done. The arrangement of his books on the side table in the spare room, which she had glimpsed through the open door, stacked with the spines aligned in the precise, particular way of someone who cares about order, not as performance, but as genuine preference. She had been cataloguing him without meaning to. That was the word for it, and she was honest enough with herself, in the dark of her own room at 5 in the morning, to use it. On Wednesday evening, he cooked properly, not the efficient Tuesday night pragmatism of using what needed using, but something deliberate, something that required the good pan and the fresh herbs, and a duration of preparation that meant she came home to a kitchen that smelled of something warm and specific and generous. He was at the stove when she arrived, his back to the door, and he said 10 minutes without turning around. And she stood in the kitchen entrance for a moment longer than 10 minutes required, looking at the line of his shoulders and the automatic competence of his hands, and the steam rising from the pot with the patience of something that has been given exactly the right conditions and is simply responding. She set the table. He brought the food. They sat across from each other in the kitchen's warmth, and ate and talked, and she was aware with every exchange, every sentence, every silence, every moment his eyes found hers across the table, of the specific quality of a thing that is being experienced and simultaneously already remembered. She refilled his wine without asking. He noticed and looked at her, and what passed across his face was not the managed neutrality, and was not even the open expression she had learned to read, but something quieter and more internal than either. The expression of someone receiving something small and particular and feeling it at a depth disproportionate to its scale. "Stop," she said. "What?" "Looking at me like that." "Like what?" he said, carefully. His wineglass was between his fingers, not lifted. "Like you're already somewhere else." She held his gaze without softening it. "You're still here. Be here." Something moved through him. She could see it move, a visible shift in the set of his jaw, the slight repositioning of his weight in the chair, as though he'd been caught in the middle of a retreat and had turned back. "I'm here," he said. "Good," she said, and picked up her fork. Thursday came with clear, cold light and a sky the particular pale blue of late November, the colour of something scraped clean, empty of cloud, crystalline in the way that only arrived when the temperature had made everything precise. She woke at 6, which was habitual, and lay for a moment longer than habitual, and then rose and went to the kitchen. He was not there. The coffee pot was full, still hot, recently made, the timer set for her usual time with an adjustment of 10 minutes that he'd figured out sometime in the second week and had never mentioned making. 2 mugs were on the counter. The kitchen was in its morning state, clean, ordered, the list on the refrigerator with its accumulated notations in 2 different handwritings, hers precise and forward-slanting, his smaller than she'd expected, more controlled. She stood in the kitchen in the early light and poured her coffee and held it in both hands and looked at the room. At the photograph on the refrigerator she'd stopped noticing because it had simply become part of the surface of her life. At the basil plant in its restored health on the window ledge. At the chair he sat in at the kitchen table, turned at its usual angle, not the 3 degrees away of the withdrawal week, but the angle that was simply his. She heard his door. He came into the kitchen in his travelling clothes, the good ones, not the daily wear she'd become accustomed to, but the formal quality of someone going somewhere that requires a particular version of themselves to be presented. His travelling cloak was over his arm. His trunk, she could see through the hallway, was at his bedroom door. They looked at each other across the kitchen. "Coffee," she said, and it came out very nearly normal. "Please." She poured the second mug. He came to the counter and stood beside her to take it, closer than the counter required, close enough that the sleeve of his travelling shirt was an inch from her arm. And for a moment they simply stood there, both holding their coffee with the long eastern windows behind them, filling with the pale November light, and the city below beginning its particular Thursday enterprise. "The plant," he said, looking at the basil on the window ledge. "I'll look after it. It needs the outer ledge position until spring. When the angle of the light changes, you can move it back." "I know," she said. "You showed me." He looked at his coffee. She could see the muscle in his jaw doing the thing it did when he was holding something in. Not anger. She knew that now. It looked different from anger, this particular tension. This was the expression of someone managing the distance between what they were feeling and what they had decided they were going to do with it, and doing so with less success than usual. "Hermione," he said. She turned toward him. He turned toward her. They were very close in the narrow space of the kitchen, closer than they'd stood since the night at the sink when his fingers had covered hers on the panhandle and neither of them had moved. And the morning light caught the silver of his eyes, and the particular set of his expression that she had learned meant he was about to say something true. "I don't want to go," he said, simply, without architecture. She looked at him. Her heart was doing something with a quality she did not have a clinical description for. Not the racing urgency of alarm, but something steadier, something with weight and warmth, something that had been building in the low register for 8 weeks and had arrived here, at this point, as simply and irrevocably as water arriving at its level. "Then stay," she said. The word hung between them in the kitchen light. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on any version of him. Not the boy she'd known at school, not the guarded professional of ministry corridors, not the controlled, careful man who'd sat on a station bench pretending to read. This expression was none of those. It was the face of someone standing on the far side of every managed distance they had ever constructed, finding the ground on that side solid. "The manor," he started. "Will be there," she said. "It will always be there. It's not going anywhere." She held his gaze with the directness she usually reserved for things she was entirely certain about, and she was entirely certain about this. You can go back to it. You can go back whenever you need to, but you could also... She stopped, revised, because precision mattered. "I'm asking you to come back, not to the apartment necessarily. Just to me." She felt the plainness of the sentence as she said it, the absence of qualification or protective framing, and she felt also the strange lightness of a thing said without those protections, the specific relief of a sentence that means exactly what it says. "Come back to me." He set his coffee down on the counter. She had time to register this, the deliberate placement of the mug, both hands free. And then he was closer, and his hand came up to the side of her face with the careful, unhurried certainty of someone who has thought about this and is now simply doing it, his fingers at her jaw and his thumb at her cheekbone. And she felt the warmth of his hand against her face and the slight roughness of his silver ring against her jaw, and she looked up at him at close range, at the grey eyes and the line of his mouth, and the expression on it that was the most unmanaged thing she had ever seen from him. He kissed her, not urgently, not the culmination of something desperate or dramatic, but with the slow, deliberate quality of everything that had been building between them for 8 weeks, which was not desperate and had never been dramatic, but had been from a cold stone bench at 2:30 in the morning, patient, thorough, entirely committed to its own direction. She kissed him back. Her hands found the front of his travelling shirt, and she felt his exhale against her mouth, a long, deep breath out, as though he'd been holding it since November, since October, since a rainy Sunday afternoon when he'd leaned 1 inch forward and the phone had lit up and something had stepped back from an edge. He kissed her the way he did everything that mattered to him, with complete attention, with precision, with nothing withheld. When they stopped, they stayed close, her hands on his chest, his at her face, the November light around them, and the coffee going cool on the counter, and the city below conducting its ordinary business, entirely indifferent to the specific and extraordinary fact of 2 people standing in a kitchen, having arrived, finally, in the same place at the same time. She looked up at him. He looked at her with the open expression and something else beneath it, something uncomplicated, unmanaged, something she'd seen only briefly in glimpses and was now seeing fully in the clear light of a Thursday morning. Relief. The specific, profound relief of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has found, against all the predictions of their own history, someone standing on the other side willing to take half the weight. "I'll come back," he said. "I know," she said. He pressed his forehead to hers briefly. Not a kiss, something quieter than that, something that required no vocabulary. And she closed her eyes for a moment and felt the particular warmth of it, the specific reality of him being here, being present, being someone who had stopped managing the distance. He went back to the manor. He went that Thursday as planned. His trunk, his travelling cloak, the dragonhide case with his potions reference texts. He stood in her doorway with all of it and looked at her one last time with the expression that no longer needed to be managed. And she leaned against the doorframe and looked back, and he said Saturday, and she said Saturday, and that was sufficient, because it was true. Saturday came. He was there in the morning at the kitchen table when she woke, arrived before 6, coffee already made, a second mug already down. The basil plant stood in its proper position on the outer ledge. The refrigerator list had a new notation in his small, controlled handwriting. The chair at the kitchen table was at its usual angle. She stood in the kitchen doorway in her dressing gown and looked at him, and he looked up at her. And what passed between them in that unremarkable Saturday morning light was not the charged awareness of new things, but something that had made room for itself beside the charged awareness, something quieter, more durable, the specific warmth of a thing that has been tested by the ordinary and has held. She crossed the kitchen and poured her coffee. She sat down across from him. Outside the window, the basil stood in its light. The city went about its patient, indifferent business. Somewhere below, a door opened, and the sound of it rose briefly to the 4th floor and dissolved. He slid the journal across the table toward her. Her 3rd manuscript, printed, the pages held together with a clip. The first page marked in 3 places with his precise small annotations in the margins. She looked at it, looked at him. "It's better than you've been telling yourself," he said. She picked it up. She looked at the first annotation, not a correction, not a criticism, but a question in the margin, the kind of question that meant someone had read carefully and wanted more. The kind of question that meant someone believed in the thing they were reading. She pressed her lips together against something that was going to be difficult to keep off her face entirely, and failed, and looked up at him. And he was watching her with the expression that had no architecture of protection in it at all. Just the undefended reality of a man sitting in a kitchen on a Saturday morning, who had come back and intended to keep coming back, and was, in this specific moment, entirely sure. She reached across the table. Her hand found his. Not dramatically, not with urgency, but with the simple, committed weight of something that knows where it belongs. His fingers closed around hers. Outside the window, the November light held everything in its pale, clear radius. The city and the basil plant and the kitchen and the 2 of them at the table, and asked nothing of any of it except to be exactly what it was. That was enough. That was, it turned out, precisely enough.
This story started with a simple question: what happens when a proud person has nowhere to go? Not a war, not a curse, not a dramatic choice, just nowhere to go, and someone notices and lets them in. That's it. That's the whole beginning. I think the most interesting love stories are not about grand gestures, they're about small ones. Someone makes coffee, someone moves a dying plant into the light, someone marks your page before you wake up. You don't fall in love in a single moment, you fall in love in 100 tiny moments that you almost don't notice until you do. Draco was not easy to write because proud people are hard to love in real life too. They push you away before you can leave. They manage the distance so nobody gets too close. But sometimes, if you are patient enough, they stop. They just stop, and that moment is everything. Hermione knew who he was, all of it, the before and the after, and she chose to hold both without fluttering either one. That is not a small thing, that is a very rare thing. I wrote this for everyone who has ever been on a cold bench pretending everything is fine, and for everyone who ever sat down nearby and waited, without making it a big deal, without asking too many questions, just sat down. That kind of quiet kindness changes people. It changed him. Thank you for listening.